It's Amy from Go With Less. I'm glad that you're here. In today's bonus video, we're going to be doing something a little different. I am talking with Brent and Michael from Brent and Michael are goingplaces.com. In our Facebook group, our Go With Less Facebook group, Michael shared a whole bunch of insights into North Macedonia, and there was so much feedback and interest that this was born, and it was, I think, phenomenal, because we're going to be able to bring a lot of insight about Eastern Europe, a little Central Europe, to our audience. Now, if you don't know Michael and Brent and Michael, they are at the website Brent and Michael are goingplaces.com. They are phenomenal writers. I read their posts regularly. They're full-time nomads, and we're going to get right into it with them. So if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for being here. We're recording this live in our Facebook group, so we're watching the replay later. So welcome, Michael and Brent, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us, Amy. I will say I'm drinking a glass of wine, but in our time zone, we're in London, so it's 6:30 here, or 5:30, I guess. So, but no judgment. If it's not 5:30 there, you can have a glass of wine too.
I wasn't judging.
We do Brent and Michael are Going Places, and we're also a newsletter, which you can sign up at our website, Brent and Michael are goingplaces.com.
And I highly recommend it. I love both of their writing style, which is interesting that you like both couples' writing style. Okay, so you guys have been together for a long time, and you've been nomads for a long time. So talk us just a little bit about your nomad adventure as we get this kicked off.
We've been a couple for 30 years, and then 6 years ago in January, we left the United States and we started traveling as nomads full time. So we since lived in, oh gosh, it's over 20 countries at this point. It was funny. The first couple of years, it was so much fun to reel off the list of countries. And now when I meet somebody and they ask me, I'm like, oh God, do you really want to hear it all? I can't remember them all. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And about 3 years ago, we're both writers, so we work remotely. We've always worked remotely. We stupidly lived in Seattle for 25 years, which is one of the most expensive cities in the world. And then we left to travel the world, and we discovered we can live. Actually, it's ridiculous how cheaply we live compared to what our life, but it's less than half what we were spending. So we really are going with much, much less than it used to be. And so people talk about, all our friends in the United States talk about inflation, and I'm still over the moon that our cost of living is so low. But anyway, so we started writing about our travels 3 years ago, and we had a really good response. And so now we both do that about half time in addition to our other projects.
And you are slowly traveling, though. You're not like buzzing through quickly.
We are slow mads, and we thought we coined that term until somebody told us that's been around for a long time. But we are slow mads, which means we stay in a country anywhere between 1 and 3 months. And then in between changing countries, we tend to make a little visit. Some country city that we're transiting through. We just spent a month on the Cinque Terre in Italy, and then on our way to London, we visited friends in Gouda, Netherlands, and popped into Amsterdam. So that tends to be the mix. So we actually much prefer the slow travel. I hate going to a city now and trying to see things in 4 or 5 days. I'd much rather be here for 2 months and just go see something one day, take off a couple days, and go back and see something else.
And you're in short-term rentals when you stay.
So it's a combination of we did co-living prior to COVID. We haven't done that in a few years. We used to do co-living for nomads. We do short-term housing, Airbnb, booking.com. We're doing house sitting right now in London. We've done some house sitting. We stayed with friends. It sounds more mysterious. I mean, it seems to make sense in my mind, but we have a convoluted list of places where we stay. I'd say about half the time it's Airbnb, and the other half of the time it's just like an opportunity comes up. But it's surprising how often strange opportunities do come up, like this house sitting in London.
We can say the same thing. We've already signed up for house sits almost into 2024. We have one pending, and they just come to us, and it's hard to say no when they're really great. So it's nice you're in London for Christmas time, your Victorian Christmas. Okay, so you have been talking about Eastern Europe for quite some time. What is it that brought you to this region?
Well, our first year of travel, we had everything perfectly planned out. We started off in Miami. We were supposed to be going to London and then Paris, and I can't remember where after that. It was just like that first year I was really paranoid. I wanted everything mapped out. And of course, life being what it is, it all fell apart after Miami. Our plans all completely fell through the roof. And then we had to go to Schengen zone, and we were trying to figure out where the heck we could go.
Which for people who don't travel at Schengen zone, so there's the European Union and there's the Schengen zone, and they're not quite the same thing, but there are 27, I think. Croatia is just joining the Schengen zone. It's a 28 nation area that has common borders, which means you can go in and then you can cross any border and you don't have to do passport control. But it also means they have a single visa, which is 3 months, 90 days in any 180-day period. And you can't like leave and then come back and reset it like in a lot of countries. So we were done with our Schengen time. We had spent 90 days in Western Europe, and we thought, well, we don't want to go back to the United States. I guess we could go to these countries that we've only heard about, you know, like behind the Iron Curtain when we were kids. And people kept saying you should go to Bulgaria. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. There's a nomad community there in a town called Bansko. And so that's how we ended up there in the first place.
So tell me your thoughts about Eastern Europe when you first arrived.
Well, we really didn't know what to expect. We had a lot of stereotypes about what it was going to be like in Eastern Europe, you know, from the food to what the landscape was going to look like being post-Soviet and the architecture of the buildings. And we went to a town called Bansko, which is this charming mountain town. And so we were immediately surprised by how much beautiful nature there was. We were amazed at the cost of living in Bansko. It was just shocking. Our apartment there cost about $300 a month for a pretty darn nice apartment.
At the end of the 3 months that we were living in Bulgaria, our landlord came to us and said, you know, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to charge you for utilities. That wasn't included in the rent. And my heart sank, and I thought, oh, here we go. You know, here's where we're going to get screwed. And we've been paying $300 a month rent, and the utilities were, of course, $4, you know, or $5, something like that. And so I felt really stupid. But it was interesting. You know, flying into Sofia in Bulgaria, it was on one hand very gritty. You know, there are places that are run down, and in Bansko there was a building boom in the mid-aughts and then everything crashed, and so there was this ring of abandoned, half-finished condos around. It's a ski town, and you know, there's some deep poverty, but at the same time, you know, there's a lot of old world natural charm, just like in Western Europe. A lot of these places, because this was under Soviet occupation for so many years, a lot of these charming villages were basically left intact. And the natural world was also left intact. You know, it wasn't exploited the way it might have been in the West. I know some areas of Eastern Europe obviously were. But so it was this weird contradiction. It really upended our stereotypes in a lot of ways, in that on one hand, yes, it was dirty and gritty, but on the other hand, it was really charming, and it was the natural beauty just blew me away. And it was more than anything, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it was just so accessible. You know, most people spoke English. The cost of living, as Michael suggested, was really, really low. It really blew our minds. It wasn't what we expected. It was what we expected in some ways, and it wasn't what we expected at all in other ways.
I just want to clarify, parts were dirty and gritty. Bansko itself, the town, is a beautiful cobblestone streets with the mountains right behind it. I mean, it's absolutely lovely. You would not go there and look around, you know, the core part of it and think, this isn't a very nice place.
And they had a beautiful modern freeway from Sofia. You know, it looks just like Western Europe in a lot of ways. It's a weird contradiction. You know, it's a country that is sort of moving into the modern world, which is fascinating in and of itself. But all that entails. Now, Bulgaria is a particularly poor country in Eastern Europe. There are other countries, you know, Hungary, Czechia, you know, which is technically Central Europe. There are other countries that are not that poor. There's a range. Bulgaria is among the poorer, but they all have, you know, things to recommend them.
When it comes to Bansko, because that's a ski town, is it really only affordable in off season during the summertime?
Actually, so about 10 years ago, two enterprising nomads created a co-working community in town. They realized that the town was vacant about half the year. So they set up some co-working facilities, and now it's become sort of a nomad hub. But so no, it's cheap. Even in the winter, it's going to be fairly cheap.
I think they even do a digital nomad conference there this past year. A friend of mine was engaged.
They've got lots of things, and now they're moving into co-living. You know, they've got all kinds of things going on. It's a really interesting little place.
So let's step back a little bit. Where have you been? Let's talk about the locations themselves, like just the high level.
The places we've lived in Eastern Europe now include Bulgaria, Serbia, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina,
Romania, Hungary, Czechia, Croatia, Georgia. Turkey isn't really, but it's in the same sort of area. Greece, Armenia.
Well, those are some other places we visited, but yeah.
We lived in Georgia.
good.
What are we forgetting? And we're probably forgetting. We've lived in-
Albania? I hear Albania every
No,
day.
we wanted to make it into Albania. We have neither visited nor lived there.
we were right across the lake, but we didn't actually make it into
It's
Albania.
amazing. About 6 years ago, I heard nothing about Albania. A day doesn't go by that I don't hear about Albania.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, these, I mean, I think it's for a lot of different reasons. It's the cost of living. We had been in Eastern Europe all year, and then there was COVID a couple of years before that. Now being back in Western Europe, we were in Italy 2 months ago, and then we were in the Netherlands, and we're sort of overwhelmed by the over-tourism. Everywhere you go, even in the fall, even in October, even in November, you just have this crush of people. And I know it's partly COVID, but it's also just over-tourism in general. And what's strange about it is that hasn't happened to Eastern Europe yet, and they desperately want the tourism. They need the tourism. They want visitors to come. So it's a combination of, you don't have locals who are wary and sick of tourists. They welcome you. They're hospitable. And then also you just don't have to deal with that mad crush of crowds everywhere you turn.
That's great to hear. Now, when you're traveling, so say you're in Bulgaria or North Macedonia, are you really just sticking to the town where you're staying, or how far out do you get to go? Do you ever even take like little trips within your stay where you might even go further away that requires overnights or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. When we lived in Tbilisi, Georgia, we hired a driver who took us down into Armenia for 3 days. So we've done trips like that. We've taken buses places, we've rented cars with friends, we visited Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina while we were living in Split over this past winter.
We do a lot of biking, yeah. I mean, Europe doesn't have the rail service that Western Europe has. They do have rail lines. But as I said before, the trains sometimes go really, really slow, but they're really, really cheap too. Sometimes they're stunningly beautiful, stunningly scenic. Oftentimes, but again, because the cost of living is so cheap, we'll just hire a driver. Our driver to Armenia that Michael mentioned, there were 4 of us, and it was the whole thing cost, the deal was we pay him $100 3 days and then pay for his lodging and his meals. And then we tipped him heavily after that, but it's ridiculously inexpensive.
Talk about the highlights of locations. What would you highly recommend, and maybe ones that you wouldn't recommend?
Well, for me, my 2 absolute favorites are Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Ohrid in North Macedonia. The history in Sarajevo, the location of the city sits in a valley that's just beautiful. And the people in Sarajevo were just absolutely wonderful, lovely people. My least favorite country was Serbia pretty easily. And my least favorite location there was a town called Novi Sad. Novi Sad is a perfectly nice town to live in. It's just not a great place to visit, especially for a month. So I would steer clear of that. In Serbia in general, it just didn't have the charm, the anything that the rest of Eastern Europe had that we experienced.
A good place to start might be like Croatia, which is probably the most Western. I mean, either Czechia, Prague, or Croatia are a very sophisticated tourism industry. But I like the countries, Bosnia-Herzegovina, that were a little less slick, and everything was sort of delightful. You could sort of, everything hadn't been Instagram to death, and people are so wonderfully hospitable. I love Romania. We got to know a lot of local people in Romania, and they would say, "Why are you here? Why don't I want to get out of here?" And I would say, "Stunningly beautiful, the mountains and the forests and the charming little villages." There's a place called Sibiu, Romania, that was just lovely. I also loved Georgia, which is about as far east as you can go. And not be in Asia, but Georgia is, and cost of living extremely low, but they're sort of at the crossroads, a little bit like Istanbul, east and west, and they have this cuisine that is somehow an amalgamation of all the surrounding cultures, Russian and Middle Eastern, and I have predicted for years, ever since we lived in Georgia, that Georgian cuisine will one day be the sort of trendy cuisine of the world. They have this kinkali dumplings, which are, they come without a dipping sauce because they cook cheese or meat, they steam them, and then it creates this broth inside the dumpling. And then so you bite the dumpling and you suck the broth out and eat the filling and the luscious dough. And it's unlike, it's stewed meats and vegetables and these nutty sauces. We were out to dinner once. We were there with friends, We're eating out every night. And I said, we were getting all these sort of fusion, I thought they were, Pan-Asian and Middle Eastern dishes. And I think this is really interesting cuisine, but why don't we try some local, some traditional Georgian cuisine sometime rather than this trendy stuff that we're eating every night. And they said, this is traditional Georgian cuisine. This is what they eat, these really rich, nutty sauces. And it was so good and so flavorful. And what you get in Eastern Europe, it's a good metaphor for Eastern Europe in general. What you get is that sense of discovery, because it hasn't been Instagram to death. You haven't read a zillion things about it, especially 5 years ago when we were there. And it's like, so then you get to travel in the best possible way. You get that joy of subtle discovery, this unexpected delight that, I didn't expect this. This is something that I never would have known if I hadn't come to this particular place at this particular time.
That sounds fabulous. And actually, Tbilisi's food scene has been on the rise, and I've been reading about it quite a bit. And what's interesting, I used to live in Manhattan. I had never seen Tbilisi Georgian food. So we are, I say half the reason we're nomads is for the food. So the idea that they have this incredible cuisine and it's completely undiscovered. So if you're watching on YouTube, if you know of around the world, not in Georgia, like where can you get good Georgian food? Please put that in the comments, because I've been hearing about it and it sounds great, and it's on our radar certainly someday after things calm down.
As you said, part of the reason why we travel is the food, and you've got this entire region of the world where you've got cuisines that are completely unknown, and they're all different. Half the countries here are Muslim, and so you got the influence of all these different cultures, and they're similar, but then they can be dramatically different. What's the meat dish?
Cevape.
Cevape. They all argue who invented cevape, which is like a sausage, like a grilled sausage. And the Croatians say they do it better, and the Bosnians say they do it better, and the Serbs say they do it better. It's like, well, why not decide for yourself? Travel to all these countries and taste the subtle differences and have them explain what the differences are and make the case. And that's literally why we travel.
That's why we're going to get along when we meet. That's one of many reasons. It sounds like pizza in the United States. Okay.
I don't want to get too bogged down in food, but the other thing, so Eastern European
get
wine,
bogged down in food.
wines, they're often not imported out of their country. Like Serbia, for example, they consume 98% of their wines, but they're in the same latitude, same region as France. So they're producing these wonderful wines that are $3 a bottle, which is the equivalent of $15 or $20 in Western Europe, or 20 euros. And so you also get to enjoy the wine culture, which is different. They've got different wine cultures. And it's just all these unexpected things that you just can't get in Western Europe anymore, because it's also, you've just read so much about it and it's so famous. It's also transcribed. And that isn't the case in Eastern Europe.
Actually, a friend of mine who's on this call watching had raved about the wine culture in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. So yeah, so that was something that wasn't even on my radar until he's like, you really have got to check this out. One of our viewers on this today, Christopher, says Supra in Washington, D.C. is a place where you can get Georgian food, which is great because my parents live there. So we're back there every single year. So I'm off to Supra in August of next year, because that's our next day.
I think every one of these countries, and this is, I want to acknowledge that, we have massive Western privilege. It's blown my mind. We're so privileged to be as wealthy as we are. But every one of these countries, they all have excellent cooks, and yet they're somewhat frustrated because oftentimes they can't leave. They're not part of the Schengen zone. They're not part of Western Europe. So in order to share their cuisine with the world, we have to come to them. And they are so hospitable and so welcoming, and they want us to come and taste our food. But these are supremely talented chefs, even though they're in Armenia, some little hole in the wall in Armenia, but they are very, very, very talented. And, so you can have a fantastic meal for, 10 euros a person, and you can taste some of the great, and they love it and you love it. It's win-win.
That sounds fabulous. So you've talked about the pros, the cost of living, the beauty of the nature, and the fact that you don't have everyone taking selfies and Instagram shots. The food. Are there other pros that some big ones that we're missing? How about the weather?
The weather in the Balkans and Eastern Europe can be difficult. It was very hot this summer.
Yeah.
When we were in Serbia, it was hitting 40 degrees, which is about 97, 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And a lot of places don't necessarily have air conditioning. It got pretty uncomfortable, and winters there can be pretty chilly as well. That being said, spring and fall are absolutely beautiful. When we were at Ohrid, we were there for the month of September, and it was just spectacular. We had day after day of mostly sunny skies with these amazing sunsets over the lake. Temperature was perfect. It was never too hot. It was never too cold at night. So if you're willing to put up with a little bit of heat, a little bit of chill, it's pretty wonderful.
Also, a word about safety, I mean, I think that's a concern for every traveler. And it's incredibly safe. And one of the things I didn't understand before I lived in a lot of Muslim countries is how seriously they take some of the tenets of their religion. And, A, they are incredibly hospitable, all of the countries we've lived in. But B, they also really take seriously the prohibitions against theft. And we felt so very, very, very safe. And anytime, not just safety, but at any time we were like lost or confused. One time we were traveling with a woman, and she did not have she left her smartphone. She hadn't written down the address of her homestay. And so we had to track down her homestay in this neighborhood. And literally the neighbors were coming out of their houses. They didn't speak English, but they're like, well, let us help you find you. She didn't know the address. So we're just wandering around asking people, and the whole neighborhood pitched in. And that's sort of the vibe throughout Eastern Europe. People are so friendly and so hospitable, a little gruff sometimes in some of these countries. In the non-Muslim countries, they can be a bit gruff. But for the most part, people are just really looking out for you. If you're confused, if you're lost, they want to get you wherever you're going.
That sounds fantastic. How about some of the cons? Weather, it could be, as long as you're in the sweet spot, the weather, I'll tell you. So I'm the princess and the pea here with the weather, and we are really traveling. We've been in Europe. Yeah, we've been in Europe for 2 different summers, actually. And I'm even going to lump in this last summer, the 3rd summer. We were at the coast, made it a lot different. But these 40 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees, when you don't, this is unbearable. And so when you don't have air conditioning, so we're just sitting inside for hours and hours and hours during the day. So we have to, and that's the beauty with our lifestyle, is that you can pick these sweet spots. The challenge is there's only so many of these spring and fall months that everywhere is beautiful. So that's, I think it's like the thing that we have to manage as nomads is how to get to the nice places during the nice times when you only have so many years to do this and so many falls you can enjoy.
I do think, there is, further north, it's going to be colder, but further south, Turkey southern Turkey is mild year round. You do have options. And, Bosnia is, Sarajevo, which is a wonderful city, is in the mountains, which I didn't know. I should have known because the Olympics were there. But it's in the mountains. But then there are coastal areas in Albania or Montenegro. We do have options. There's a variety of climates. But in terms of cons,
so to answer your cons questions, we've been doing this 6 years. So a lot of the cons in the early days we've gotten past in terms of I no longer expect to find certain Western food items that I'm used to. I no longer consider that a negative, that I can't go into the store and get my peanut butter, whatever it is. So if you're new to this and that's important to you, you might run into that as a con. You sort of can't get your old items that you're used to. For me, the 2 big cons were the smoking, which is very, very prevalent in Eastern Europe. I mean, you're actually able to legally smoke indoors in Serbia, which was very frustrating. I was glad we were there in summer, so that it was easy to sit outside most of the time. But basically, any coffee shop, any cafe, any restaurant where you went inside, there would be people smoking. And even in Macedonia, where technically you can't smoke and legally you're not supposed to smoke inside, people still smoke inside anyway. So if you're at all sensitive to cigarette smoke, that was definitely a con. I did not like that at all. I would say the other big con to be aware of, hopefully won't be a factor for most of us, but the healthcare systems, the medical care systems in these countries, because a lot of these countries are so poor or so new. Macedonia has only been around, 25 years. They're not very good healthcare systems. And people in Bosnia specifically said, don't get sick here. If you get sick here, get in a car and drive to Croatia. You do not want to be sick here in Sarajevo. So that is something to be aware of. And that's a reason you should definitely have good health insurance, good travel insurance in case you have to be evacuated out of Serbia or Bosnia to somewhere, if you need actual surgery.
I do think one needs to make a bit of a mental leap. When we first arrived in a lot of these places, you look at the apartment buildings, and they can be quite weathered. And you think, you know, it can look Soviet era. Some areas can look, you know, like Soviet era, really depressed. When we were in Tbilisi, Georgia, our apartment was on the 16th floor, and it was an Airbnb, but the guy had said, you know, for sure bring a tetra, what was it, a coin, which is like 3 cents coin, because the elevator is coin operated. So that's fine, no big deal. But you know, we got in at 4 a.m. just for sure you have your tetra coin. So, but the elevator was the size of like a phone booth, and it looked like it had been. It had also, you know, last been inspected, you know, in the era of phone booths, like in 1985, and so we get in and we put in our coin, and it squeals, the door squeals, and then it rumbles up, and then when we come to a stop, and they go stunk, and I'm thinking, oh my God, we're gonna fall. And you know, it did this every time for 3 months that we lived there. And there's an emergency button, and it said, you know, in case of emergency, press here, or whatever. It said it in Georgian. And at one point, I said, I bet that's not hooked up to anything. And at some point, a local person, you know, the building got in the elevator, and I said, is this hooked up to anything? And they said, no. If you press it, it doesn't make any. So it's like when we were in Bulgaria, our apartment caught on fire, and we had no smoke detectors and no fire alarms, and there were no fire extinguishers in the hallway, and that's the whole thing, which you can read about on our website. And you know, you do have to accept. You have to accept a certain level. It's a poor country, and it's a country with different traditions and different standards. All of it's poor area and different standards, and you have to accept that. In a way, I find that really, really interesting, seeing how other people live. But I will say, every time, the first few times we would arrive in a new country, I would be a little shocked sometimes. But then, like, I remember when we arrived in a couple of our apartment buildings, like the one in Tbilisi, I was shocked. But within 2 days, it had disappeared. You know, all the stray cats that would feed in the dumpster, and not homeless people exactly, but the poverty. But then it's not that I would ignore it, but it would become part of my community, and I would accept it, and I realized this is nothing to be afraid of. In a lot of ways, it's really interesting. And you know, what are they called in Georgia? The metzes. The metzes. There's something called it means a person. Mezove, a person of the street, and they clean the street, clean the neighborhood, and everybody gives them a couple of whatever the local currency is. My mind remembers none of these terms, but anyway, it's just a thing. And we, you know, Michael got to know these people. You would chat with them. And that, again, it's not just about interacting with food, it's about interacting with the people, getting to know people, and seeing the world from a different point of view, and meeting people who were raised communist, people who were raised before the fall of the Iron Curtain, talking. I studied this in college, and having dinner conversations with people who were alive during the Soviet era is far and away outweighs the discomfort of that elevator, you know. But a mental leap is required in some of these countries, not Croatia. But if you go to Georgia, yes. If you go to Romania, it's sort of somewhere between the two extremes. But I just, you know, that's part of it. But again, it's not anything I ever have felt unsafe, except for the occasional fire. I guess I'm saying contradictory things. I'm just saying.
Well, if I can jump in, this is sort of one of the cons I was talking about that we've gotten used to, that if you are coming to Eastern Europe for the first time, you do need to be mentally prepared that it's probably going to take you a while to adjust to these different conditions. We've been doing this long enough that when we got to Sarajevo and I got on the tram system that dates back to the 1980s, because most of their tram system was destroyed during the war, and other countries shipped in their old trams, and then they used the ones that have been shot up that were still operating. I got on that tram, and part of me was like, wow, this is really old and ancient and antique. But I wasn't bothered by that because I'd seen so much of this there. But if you are thinking about going to Eastern Europe, you do need to be mentally prepared that it is going to be very different from Western Europe, and frankly, even Central Europe.
But I guess the point is, we've traveled in Central and South America, and we've traveled in Asia. And it's not like Central and South America. It's not that kind of gritty. I've never felt personally unsafe. I don't think it is unsafe. It is a very safe area of the world. It just has different traditions and different sort of standards when it comes to building codes and stuff like that. And even Asia, it doesn't have the chaos of Asia. It's a relatively easy travel location, but at the same time, you need to make a mental leap. You need to accept that things will not be exactly as it's easier than Asia, it's easier than Central and South America, but it's not Western Europe, I guess is what I'm saying.
And you've mentioned a lot of different countries. So so back in 2018, we were doing a video every day from a 9-week trip in to Central Europe, and that included Prague and Budapest, which you're highlighting in this. And so these areas were not compromised. They were more in the Western Europe.
That's right.
So maybe in the countries that because you've mentioned a lot of countries. So if you're going to maybe tiptoe a little bit from Western Europe, from the England and France and Spain and Italy and Portugal, if you're going to Germany, if you're going to be kind of like giving, like, I don't know, like this one is a little more challenging, is there anything that really just jumps to your mind?
Excellent question. Yeah, and I think Czechia, the Czech Republic, where Prague is a fantastic city, very Western. Hungary, same thing. Budapest, fantastic city, very Westernized. Croatia.
Yeah, in those 3 countries, I never felt anything like, oh, I'm basically in Western Europe. It never struck me that I was anything different. Romania definitely is sort of where you take that first big step, and it's like, okay, I'm no longer in a typical Western European country. You get on a Romanian train, for instance, and it's like, well, this is definitely an older train, and things are being done a little bit differently here. You go to an outdoor market in Serbia. There's a wonderful outdoor market. But trust me, it's nothing like a Western market. In Barcelona, I can't remember the name of it, Lobokeria. It's nothing like that. It's very much, these ladies who look like they just harvested the potatoes in the field. Their hair's wrapped up in a handkerchief. They've come in and they're selling their produce right there. So that definitely feels differently. And then as you go further east, it continues to sort of not degrade, to just be different. And then the bigger town you're in, the less it feels that way. Belgrade, again, felt very much like a Western European city. It wasn't not particularly jarring. Novi Sad starts to feel, a little bit differently. And then the farther you go out from those and you get into the smaller towns, it starts to feel much more rough around the edges. And Macedonia, absolutely beautiful and wonderful, but it's a relatively new country that's definitely still trying to come into its own. And that could feel, we were in Ohrid one day and the water in the building went out. I was literally in the shower. It was at that moment where I'm soaked from head to toe and the water stops.
For 4 hours.
Yeah, it was out for 4 hours. So I had to get a bottle of water and rinse
And
off.
it wasn't, they were just doing construction, but they don't tell you. That's the kind of thing. They just turn off the water for 4 hours. That's the kind of thing you might expect. But that said, I mean, there is an exact correlation between the Western, conveniences and the price. So the Czech Republic is going to be comparable to Italy, maybe, or southern Spain. It's going to be cheaper than Northern Europe, but it's going to be relatively expensive. Same thing with Hungary, same thing with Budapest. Whereas Montenegro, the other countries that might be a little more challenging are going to be a lot cheaper.
We haven't been to Albania yet, but our friends do tell us that is probably the least developed, roughest country in Eastern Europe.
I don't think so. Not lately. Not lately. But, Bosnia and Herzegovina, because of the war all through the 90s, it's interesting because it's Bosnia and Herzegovina, like one country with 2 names, is right next to Croatia. And they were both part of Yugoslavia. There were 7 nations that made up the former Yugoslavia that are Serbia and North Montenegro and Kosovo and Croatia. These were all one country, but now there's 7 countries. Croatia, right after the fall of Yugoslavia, sort of joined the Western tourism. Dubrovnik is there and Split, and they're now essentially a Western European country, very sophisticated tourist industry, as I said before. Bosnia collapsed into infighting and then a war with Serbia all through the 90s, and as a result, they were delayed. And so they really are. It's fascinating to see the 2 countries side by side, and one has a modern economy and the other doesn't. And it is, I just loved Bosnia and Herzegovina. I loved the people, and I would sort of make a plea to go there because the people need you to go there. They want you to go there. But it is, as a result of the war, it is a country that is sort of rebuilding itself. 30% of the city of Sarajevo is on antidepressants. Everybody we talked to lived through the siege of Sarajevo, which was a 4-year siege. It was, people died. There was atrocities.
It's a very sobering experience. You walk around the streets of Sarajevo and you see bullet holes, in many of the walls still there. You will see bombed out buildings. We hired a driver one day who took us around, and when he was 16, He was fighting in the war. He was shot in the back. He showed us the hill where his brother was shot and killed. So it's a very different experience.
They had the Olympic platform where they awarded the Olympic medals during the Sarajevo Olympics, which they used to execute people during. Anyway, but that said, I loved Bosnia and Herzegovina in part because the people were so hospitable and friendly. Sarajevo is now a Muslim city because the non-Muslims were all mostly killed during the war, but the people were so friendly and hospitable, and I loved that they welcomed us into their community. And it was, in a way, I think I enjoyed the experience more. As much as I liked Dubrovnik, that's like Western Europe, and you're with 50 zillion other tourists, and there wasn't really anything unique. It wasn't personalized to me. And yet I felt like Bosnia and Herzegovina, if it was a little bit more challenging, it was a lot more interesting in a lot of ways.
Thank you for talking about that. Now, I did several years ago when we were heading to Poland as well, and Poland is I'm sure that's on your radar.
Yes, it absolutely is. If it wasn't in the Schengen zone, we would have been there already. We dislike the Schengen zone intensely.
It's a lot like the Czech Republic, but half the price. Poland is an incredible bargain right now, compared to, technically in Central Europe. Yeah.
That 9-week stay that I mentioned, we started in Krakow, and it's such a phenomenal place. We are looking forward to a much longer stay. I do see that the pricing that we paid 4 years ago, it's still affordable, but I was surprised to see how much more it was than when we were there. We had a food tour that was such a killer deal. I sent everyone on this food tour. It was $17 for a food walking tour, which is unheard of. And now I think it's like $60, $80, the same exact tour. So things are changing, and we know that. But
it's we're to blame for that, and you're to blame for that, because we're here all talking about these places and encouraging people to go and explore them. But as that happens,
that's right. You're right.
More people coming in, and the people are gonna be like, oh, I can charge more for what we have now.
But prices have risen in Western Europe too. And so it's like prices are still the percentage that they were 5 years ago compared to Western Europe. And honestly, I've gotten to know so many Eastern and Central Europeans that makes me happy that maybe they're getting, a bigger piece of the pie. I'm glad that people are going, because I know how important it is. It breaks my heart to see the poverty and some of the living conditions. And I want more people to, unlike Western Europe, where everybody says, oh, we don't want more tourists. They do want more tourists, and I want more tourists to go there too.
There's a book I read several years ago called Hidden Europe, and it's like it's a fantastic book about Eastern Europe. And and I'd highly recommend this book. It's chapter by chapter, which is a country. Each chapter is a country. And in the foreword, he says that no matter what, the people who live in the country do not want to be identified as Eastern European, no matter how East you are. They said people in Russia do not want to be considered Eastern European. So is this something that you had, and it seemed like a very sensitive subject. So for people who may be watching who are residents of these countries, is that something you're able to talk about a little bit? This Eastern Central, it seems like this division can be fraught with challenges.
Well, what I noticed when we were in these countries was a very sad outlook on their own countries. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially, because they've been through so much, excuse my French, I literally had people say to me, why are you in this shithole country? This country is so depressed economically, things are so bad here. Why would you come here? And I had to stop and take a moment to assess my experience of the country versus theirs, because I'm looking around and going, you have all this amazing history here. This is, where World War I kicked off, and this is where the Olympics were in 1984, the first time they were held in a communist country. And look at this valley that you're in; it's absolutely beautiful. But then, as you stay, there's an advantage of being a nomad. You start learning more about the things the places you're staying. And I started to learn the educational system there is so far behind, and there's so little opportunity for many young Bosnians that there's a brain drain. There are so many young people are fleeing Bosnia for Central and Western Europe for better economic opportunities, that it's just hurting the country even more and more. And so from their point of view, it is a shithole country. It's great for me because I get to come and have this great food, and it's super affordable, and learn all these things. But for them, it's a very different experience. Yeah. So that was really eye-opening and important. I think that speaks to a little bit of this, don't call us Eastern Europe. There is a stigma of we're Eastern Europeans, we're poor, we're looked down on. we don't want to be thought of that way. And I think that's why so many countries are desperately trying to get into the Schengen zone and be the EU, is be seen differently by the rest of the world.
And it's true. Somebody, Christopher says, the Czechs don't want to be called Czechia. They don't want to be called Eastern Europe. They're definitely Central Europe. Yeah, but there are also countries. This is what's so fascinating about this area of the world. There are countries that are still aligned with Russia, with the former Soviet Union. Armenia, for example. Georgia has a very antagonistic relationship. There's a border. This is prior to the Ukraine war, but the Russians were moving the border 5 meters every year. And Georgia they're not part of NATO. They're a relatively powerless country. There's nothing they could do. And ironically, a Georgian friend just told us they actually feel safer right now from Russia because of the debacle in Ukraine, that they think, Russia's probably not going to invade because they've got so much egg on their face. So they actually feel safer right now than they did. But Armenia, they still do align with Russia. And so it's much more, Soviet, a lot of the Soviet era stuff has not been torn down. That's interesting in Georgia too, seeing the influence of the Soviet era and the Soviet parks, which are different from Western European parks and American parks. There's just so much. It really depends on where you are. But as Michael said, there is a stigma in the eye. People want to look towards the West. They want to be aligned with the West. They want to be associated with. They want to join the EU. They want to be part of the Schengen zone.
And that's partly because I think the West tends to look down on Eastern Europe. And I will say, from my own point of view, I think of these countries less, now that I've been in so many places, I think of these countries less in terms of Eastern Europe than the individual countries and the places I've been. They are no longer that big gray thing on the map. They're the individual countries and the cities and the people that I've met there. And I think that's one of the best parts of travel, which you sort of break down those stereotypes and expectations you have, and you kind of learn more of what the reality of it is like, and get a better, more real picture.
And actually, this is more for the benefit of the viewing audience on YouTube. Two people, so Tanya says a comment. She said, people do not like to be called Eastern European as it has a bad connotation. Greetings from Belgrade. And Dagmar says, being from Slovakia, former Czechoslovakia, we don't think of it as being from Eastern Europe. It's more because of the stigma associated with it from the Western point of view. So exactly what we're talking about. So something, if you're watching on YouTube, this is something that I've heard, to be sensitive about that. And we certainly want to be good visitors in a country and not being offensive in any way. Okay, so let's talk about some more specifics. So you highlighted a little bit about the language. Have you had trouble because of not speaking the language? Is English prevalent?
It depends on the country. But for the most part, you are going to have very little trouble finding someone who's an English speaker. And especially if you find somebody under 30, they're going to have some facility with English. And people older than that will often have facility with English. And if it's a tourist location, they might just have a little bit. You might be able to ask them, how much is the chicken? But we never had, but we buy a lot of chickens. We never have had a situation where we were not able to find somebody who was able to answer our question.
Or Google Translate.
Or Google Translate. But we've been shocked. When we left 6 years ago, we really thought, the lack of English speaking was going to be a problem. I speak some Russian. Brent's been studying Spanish. Usually when I try and use my Russian when I'm in a former Soviet country, people just immediately switch over to English
because they resent that he's speaking Russian, because of negative associations with the Soviet Union, or he uses a Russian word. That's not the right word.
Yeah, I don't speak Russian in Bulgaria anymore because they don't like it. I didn't know that, but I do now.
No, but that's also, I think as a general travel rule, when you're in a country that only speaks its own language, they don't really, obviously you should try to learn a few words, hello and goodbye and please and thank you and all that. And you should bend over backwards to be respectful of local mores, but they're not going to expect tourists to learn and speak the local language. Hungarians laugh that there's no such thing as a non-Hungarian accent because it's such a difficult language to learn that they don't ever hear like an English-speaking Hungarian accent because the only people who speak it are native Hungarian speakers. So they don't really expect you, whereas like when you're in Spain, so much of the world speaks Spanish that there is more of understandably, there's more of an expectation that you would learn Spanish if you're going to come to Spain. That's less of an expectation in these countries where even though many of the languages are similar, although Romania is a Romance language, it's just bizarre. So it's closer to a Western European Romance language than any of the Slavic languages. This part of the world is so fascinating. Just the history of Yugoslavia, how even back in the Soviet era, they looked towards the West. They were more afraid of the Soviet Union than they were of the West. There's just so much fun. And then it doesn't even get to the Ottoman Empire. I mean, reading about the Ottoman Empire and their forays into this part of the world, it was like I studied Western civilization, but I didn't really study this kind of history. And so when you're there, you feel stupid. I felt stupid, like I felt inadequate. But I was also just sort of stoking it up as a tourist. And I loved learning all of this, the Soviet era and then the pre-Soviet era.
I see Kuba's comment about not speaking Russian, and yes, I have learned that lesson. I do not use my Russian, except as you said, in Serbian. The fascinating thing about English is, when you first go there and you hear everybody speaking English, I was often inclined to think, oh, they've learned it for the benefit of tourists and for all the Americans that are coming here. And what we quickly came to realize is that English has become the lingua franca of so much of Europe. It's how they talk to each other. The American culture and movies are so powerful and so strong that it's infiltrated, and they've learned so much of it that it's easy for them to communicate with each other. We were on a train in Czechia, and there was a German, there was somebody from Prague, there was an Albanian, and somebody else, and they didn't know each other, but they all started talking, and they all spoke to each other in English. So I thought that was really interesting. It's much to our benefit.
We also were expecting, as world travelers, we've always expected anti-American prejudice, and we have been shocked by how little of that we've received. But sort of in Western Europe, with the exception of countries like Serbia, which is still more aligned with Russia, and also because of the UN bombing in the 90s, there is a lot of anti-American sentiment in Serbia. But most countries, they romanticize, they love America almost more than I think we deserve. But it's sort of nice as an American traveler. I don't know how many of yours are American, but there's a lot of goodwill for America. Maybe even more, there's goodwill in Western Europe too, but I was sort of surprised by both they idolize America, the prosperity, the economic prosperity, but also they feel, because of the Soviet issue, they feel a lot of goodwill and affection towards Americans, which is nice. I mean, it sucks to be the recipient of animosity. Nobody wants that.
And even Serbia, I just want to be clear, go to Serbia, go there and have a good time. They're not going to treat you badly because you're American.
No.
There's a bit of a generational thing. Some older people might hold some resentment, but if you're talking to a younger person, if you're talking to anybody under 35, the war and the bombing and all that is the past. They want to move forward, and they just don't even want to deal with that.
And speaking, did you have any issue with violence from post-war? Was that a factor at all?
You mean the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, no, not the Ukraine war. Even just in so the Kosovo and.
That is something to be mindful. To serve that there is still ongoing dispute. Serbia does not recognize Kosovo, and you cannot enter Serbia.
You cannot go from Kosovo to Serbia because there's an issue over ID cards and who recognizes and who's allowed to.
But one needs to remember that when you see a headline, that's news for a reason. When there's violence somewhere, it makes the newspaper because it's unusual. It's really, really rare. So just like there's going to be violence in LA or New York or anywhere in the United States, that's no different. It's important to be mindful of that and sign up for the State Department's emergency text, all of that. There's nothing to be afraid of. And same with the war in Ukraine. People look at a map and they think, gosh, you're awfully close to Ukraine. That's actually a world away in most of these countries. Even when you're in a bordering country, it's a world away, especially if you're in a NATO country. It's night and day. It's not something you have to worry about.
Actually, speaking of the NATO country, so we were took a cruise to the Baltics this summer, and when you were talking about the language, I just had a memory. We were out to eat. We couldn't even get these basic words, and because we were so busy with as part of our cruise video, it was like we never had time to stop and take a breath with so many ports, which was nice to see, but very, very busy. So we didn't get all these languages as we're through so many places. And so in Tallinn, Estonia, we had this real kind of hipster gathering gastropub situation. And I said, I'm so sorry, we don't speak any Estonian. She's like, every single person spoke great English. And it's hard because as we try to be courteous travelers, like you don't just want to lead with that. And it's a hard thing. And so we apologize, but they're like, no problem. And it lets me practice. And their English has been fantastic, is what we had found in many of the countries. Not all of them, but yeah.
We'll try not to assume everybody's going to speak English. Is why often in Eastern Europe I would use my Russian, because my history, I know, a lot of people were forced, unfortunately, to learn Russian. There is a lot of overlap between the languages, so I would try and use that to communicate what little bit I could, just because I didn't want to come in and walk in and say, I'm an American, you need to be speaking my language. I was doing my best to try and speak what they spoke, or as close as I could.
I get that. I speak Spanish in non-Spanish speaking countries just to be like, I'm trying to speak some other language. But the comments that we're getting from people who live in Eastern Europe is, do not speak Russian. Like that's like they'd rather have you speak English, even though you seem like an entitled jerk to, like, you may feel like you're showing entitlement, but it seems like leading with English may be the way that is the least offensive if you do not speak the local language. So I think that's helpful, because I do feel bad. And I remember we got to a Prague hotel. I was speaking with the hotel check-in person, asking about some of the words, because they were very difficult to understand by reading. And I'm okay with languages. I had a very, very hard time. Thank you. It was very, very, very hard. I don't think I ever got it. And we weren't there long enough to, we were only there for like 3 or 4 days. So I never got it. And I do, many of us try to not go into the world demanding that they speak English, but it is the default. And we're very fortunate that that's our native tongue.
I will say, every country, there are things you need to learn. I mean, that's true of everywhere you go. There are little regional differences, local differences, and you need to learn that. That's true of Western Europe too. I often think, well, Brent and Michael, they've been traveling for 6 years and they're really adventurous. And honestly, I am so not a risk-taking, adventurous person. I am such a risk-averse person. And yet this was, you want to ease your way into the deep end. You want to start in the shallow end, maybe, sure, absolutely. There'll be some things that will be strange, but this has just not been difficult for me. And if I can do it, I almost feel like anybody can do it, because I'm really kind of a wimp. You figure this stuff out, and it sounds, we're throwing a lot of information, but this is information that comes from 5 years of travel. The fact is, we did this very, very slowly, country by country, and I never felt overwhelmed. On the contrary, I have felt overwhelmed in Central and South America, and I did feel overwhelmed in Asia, but I never really did in Eastern Europe. And it's part because the people were so damn hospitable and so damn friendly and non-threatening, and it didn't, even there's not even really a concept of a con artist. There aren't enough tourists in a lot of these countries, maybe sure in Prague or in Budapest, but you don't have to worry about con artists, because there aren't enough tourists in a lot of these places for there to be a real, con artist industry, which I don't know, for a lot of ways, it was easier than in a lot of places we've been. That's all I want to say.
So, okay, so my question is about getting between these countries. So in Western Europe, they have this amazing rail system. We use Flixbus like crazy when we have been there for 2 different years pre-COVID. It was very, very cheap for long distances. We weren't giant fans overnight. We won't do it again. But the trains are amazing. Public transportation is amazing, even BlaBlaCar. How are you getting between these without a great train system?
For getting around, it's been a variety of different things. We did actually take a train from Romania into Hungary. So we use that in Eastern Europe, moving from Serbia to Macedonia, and from Bosnia to Serbia. We hired a driver. It was just so easy to take care of it.
We use a website called My Day Trip, where you just hire a driver, and it's usually somewhere between 100 and 300 euros for an afternoon to take us from one country to another. You could take a bus, and that'll be 5 or 10 euros. It's ridiculously cheap, but also the buses might be a little rough, and it's just something we're willing to splurge on. And it's nice, frankly, to be able to stop along the way. We've had really good experiences, and then usually, if we're in the area for a while, we just recontact our driver from before. We know, what to expect, and negotiate our own deal, which is usually a lot cheaper.
I think we mostly have avoided the buses because of COVID.
Yeah.
As I said, the healthcare systems in those countries, that's not a place I want to run the risk of sitting on a bus overnight with 50 people who not all of them have necessarily been vaccinated or taking a lot of precautions.
But I mean, you should take a train. You know, the train from Sarajevo to Mostar is world famous for a reason. Although it also breaks down a lot too. I mean, that's sort of, you know, pros and cons of Eastern Europe. It can be beautiful, but it can also break down. We loved the trains in Bulgaria. We love the train rides we've taken. But at the same time, you know, it is an older system. You know, it's one of those things you sort of figure once you're there, you can sort of decide for yourself. But you always have the option of hiring a driver, and that's what we've always done, and it'll be cheap.
And is this mydatetrip.com? I'm not familiar with that. Is that country specific? Is it all over Europe? Is it worldwide?
They're all over the world, but it's ridiculously expensive in Western Europe, but it's ridiculously affordable in most of Eastern Europe. So really, it'll be 100 or 200 euros to go from one country to another. And like I said, then you can negotiate with your driver to stop along the way and see what you want to see. And usually they'll have lots of great information. It'll be a local driver.
Yeah, and any issues at all with visas or crossing borders, especially when you're doing it in a car?
No, it was actually really nice to be doing it with the driver, because going from Bosnia into Serbia and then Serbia into Macedonia, our driver just spoke with the immigration people, answered any questions they had. He just answered them for us. We literally had to do nothing going into those countries except hand our driver our passport. He stamped them and let us in. It's just, travel is so easy between countries these days, especially with the passport, you know, with a Western passport.
Somebody did mention the visa situation. It is something you need to be. Every country is going to be a little different, and you know, sometimes you get a visa on arrival, and sometimes you do need to do it in advance.
Not so much in Eastern Europe, though.
Well, sure, but like Turkey, which isn't necessarily. But there's something you need to. The visa, the tourist visa will be. Georgia has a visa of a year on arrival, but not all countries do that. You need to be aware of that and mindful of that. That information is easily accessible.
Just a little note. So for the YouTube viewers, the site Rome to Rio, the number 2 RIO is my favorite way to figure out how to get from place to place. It's unbelievable. And a site Christopher also mentions OMIO, which I do not know. So I'll have to be checking that.
We use both of those a lot, but those are great to look at all.
That's the first I've heard of that. Yeah, so that's really, so I'm adding a couple, and that my day trip I've added as well. Okay, our friend Iris says they're big fans of BlaBlaCar. They used it in Bulgaria and Romania. We had I've tried to use this in France, and in Mexico. I've tried to use it in, that's like a default if I'm going place to place. You're basically taking someone's seat in a car that's going somewhere anyway. So what I find is that I can't schedule it in, I've looked at it a lot. I can't schedule it in advance because it's like, oh, I'm just going here in 2 days. So it's hard if you're wanting to know that you can get somewhere. And then it more likely than not, it has not worked out. So I've only used it twice. Even though I've tried to use it dozens of times and it's only worked out twice. So if it works, great. And it's very affordable because it's just someone who's going anyway and you just sit in the car. But you have to make all this stuff work perfectly. So the places that you mentioned, Darren and Jolene ask, there's the countries you mentioned, you don't need to get a visa in advance?
No, there's the only country I went to anywhere in Europe was Turkey. And even there, COVID, you could get one before, you could get one on arrival, but with COVID, we had to apply ahead of time. It was very easy. I mean, it was like a 15-minute process. Immediately got the electronic visa sent to us. And I imagine you could just step out of the customs line and take care of it, but it's not a visa on arrival that they just stamp your passport. You do need to have filled out a form and submitted it and have it approved.
A lot of people also rent cars and travel around the whole area. We have a number of friends who've done that, and it's really cheap to rent a car and just keep it for 6 months or 3 months. I mean, work it out with your rental company. A lot of people are asking about dogs, and it's true. It really varies by country. In some countries, they do have a problem with stray dogs or stray cats. And Islam is an issue. Muslims have a real positive view of cats, but they also provide for dogs.
They took in Istanbul. They took great care of the dogs. They dogs. They didn't, pet them or spend time with them, but they make sure they have food. They make sure they're warm and full. And in terms of traveling,
with your dog,
Yeah, with your dog, we don't have any pets, but I've got friends who have been traveling through much of Eastern Europe right now, and they never reported having any problem with people having a bad reaction to the dog. As a Westerner, as a tourist, when you're there, people are usually going to, just sort of, you're already unusual and strange, so they're not going to be worried about your traveling with a dog. They might not like dogs, but they're very unlikely to have a problem with you having a dog.
It's also generally there's a lot of rural areas. It's more rural, I think, than urban for the most part. And so that might be easier for traveling with a dog.
And I'm going to recommend two excellent YouTube couples who do travel with their dogs around Europe. And that would be Warren, Julie Travel, and Our Freedom Years. And both couples who are nomads, both have spent massive time in Europe. And I know Stephanie and Jillian of Our Freedom Years are in South America with their two little dogs now. So those are really good resources because they've done all kinds of videos about traveling with dogs. Yeah. And then I know in the GoWithLess group, there's a lot of people who are lots and lots of people travel with their dogs. So
it feels like it would be a good place to travel with your dog. I mean, even compared to Western Europe, this feels like it would be a pretty good place. A lot of places for dogs to run around, a lot of hiking. We did so much hiking all throughout the area, and we love to hike, we love to bike. And that's something we really didn't expect, that the wilderness was so wonderful and so wild. In Romania, they still have grizzly bears and wolves throughout this whole area. I didn't expect that. I was thinking it would be more like Western Europe, where it's more manicured and controlled, and it isn't in many places.
And from some friends who do travel with their pets, I know one of the big challenges is finding places that accept pets. So if that's like a prevalent, so you wouldn't have any experience with that, nor would I, but so you would have to ask somebody who's been traveling with pets, I think, if that's your question. I think that's where to go with that. So what I'm going to ask is if you can maybe be responsive in the YouTube comments, because people will ask questions there. And if you're on this call and you didn't get your question answered, I'll get this recording up, and it's going to take me about a week or two, probably 2 weeks, maybe, hopefully by the end of the month, I have this up on YouTube. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. Thank you, Brent and Michael, for sharing about this interesting area. This is an area we've just dabbled a little bit, and it's very high on our radar. So we're very excited to explore, and you've allowed us to feel more comfortable about that. So thank you.
Just put in one more plug. We do have a newsletter, Brent and Michael Are Going Places, which you can subscribe to. We have it's free, Brent and Michael Are Going Places.com, where we talk about Eastern Europe, but also all of our travels.
Yeah, and there you'll find their Facebook groups. So they're extremely active online. So if you'd like to hear more from them, which you should, definitely go check out their site, because you'll be guided to their Facebook groups and things like that on their website.
And I know people already belong to your group, Amy, but just as somebody who comes and looks for resources, GoWithLess is a phenomenal resource, and I'm so happy it exists and can go there and look for information.
It's unbelievable. The group is unbelievable. So thank you for being a very active part of it. I'm going to say one more thing before, hopefully everyone doesn't just dump off. As I mentioned at the beginning, Michael had this great post about North Macedonia and how surprisingly phenomenal it was. And people were so thrilled to hear that information. So many of us are nomads and are spending prolonged time in places and have similar information about different places. And as I see people put it all over their personal Facebook, I asked, like, can you share that in the GoWithLess group? Because this audience is hungry for this information. 8,000 people now want this information. So please share your own experiences, not just with the countries that we've discussed, but post about your experiences in the world, because we really want to hear it. And that's, again, how this came up. So thanks for suggesting this, Michael. It was a pleasure.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Amy.
Bye-bye.